6 men, 6 of the highest-ranking figures the American Mafia ever produced. Bosses, underbosses, one acting boss who sat at the very top of a New York family. Each spent decades inside a world built on one rule above every other: omertà, silence or death. And each of them, when it came down to it, broke that rule against the person closest to him. A mentor, an uncle, a partner of 20 or 30 years, because the alternative was a cell he would die in. Number 1 on this list didn't just give up a friend. He put the most powerful mob boss in America away for life and ended an era that had run for a generation. We rank all 6 by the same measure: how much damage the betrayal did to the organization. Every case on this list is drawn from federal trial transcripts, Department of Justice cooperation records, and the documented reporting of mob historians Selwyn Raab and Jerry Capecci. None of these men are romanticized figures in this account. They are the documented record of what happens inside an organization, built entirely on trust, the moment that trust runs out. Let's start at the bottom. The betrayals on this list didn't happen in one era. They span from the early 1960s to the mid-1990s, and together they trace a single pattern in the modern history of organized crime: the slow collapse of omertà itself. For the first half of the 20th century, the code mostly held. Men went to prison rather than talk. That began to break in 1963, when Joseph Valachi testified before a Senate committee and became the first made member of the Mafia to publicly confirm the organization's existence at all. What follows on this list are the men who came after him, and most of them went further than Valachi ever did, because unlike Valachi, they held actual command: an acting boss, an underboss, twice over, a nephew groomed to inherit the family business. These aren't soldiers giving up a captain. These are men at the top of the chain giving up the men who put them there. The federal RICO Act, passed in 1970 and used aggressively by prosecutors from the early 1980s onward, is the reason nearly every man on this list eventually faced the same choice: a life sentence or a witness stand. RICO didn't just let prosecutors charge a single crime, it let them charge an entire pattern of criminal activity across an organization, which meant that for the first time, the men running these families could be convicted for the family itself, not just for whatever they happened to be caught doing. That single legal shift is what turned cooperation from a betrayal of the heart into, for these 6 men, a matter of simple arithmetic. Here's how they rank. At number 6, Joseph Magliocco. By 1962, Magliocco was acting boss of the Profaci family in Brooklyn, having stepped into command after the death of longtime boss Joseph Profaci. His closest ally on the ruling commission was Joseph Bonanno, boss of the Bonanno family, and one of the most powerful men in American organized crime at the time. The two had been friends and allies for years. According to commission-era testimony, documented by historian Selwyn Raab in 5 Families, Bonanno approached Magliocco in 1963 with a plan to eliminate 2 rival bosses, Carlo Gambino and Thomas Lucchese, and redraw the balance of power in New York. Magliocco agreed to take part and arranged for a hitman, Joseph Colombo, to carry out a piece of the plot. Colombo did something neither man expected. He went straight to Gambino and told him everything. The commission convened, and Magliocco was summoned to answer for a plot to murder the very men now sitting across from him. He confessed in full, and named Bonanno as the plan's architect. The commission fined Magliocco and forced him into retirement. Bonanno, exposed by the man who had agreed to kill for him, was stripped of commission standing and driven into hiding, triggering a leadership crisis inside his own family that historians call the Banana War. Magliocco kept his life. He died of a heart attack within the year, his family's power broken behind him. Bonanno spent the rest of the 1960s fighting to reclaim standing he never fully recovered, eventually retreating to Arizona, while the family he'd built tore itself apart, in a leadership struggle historians call the Banana War, a conflict that ran for the better part of a decade after the man who exposed him made his confession. It's the smallest betrayal on this list. No federal trial, no RICO conviction, no witness stand under oath. This was still 1963. The legal tools that would define the rest of this list didn't exist yet, and Magliocco answered to the commission itself rather than a courtroom. But it's the earliest documented case of a boss-level figure giving up a close ally to save himself rather than take the fall. Everything else on this countdown follows the pattern Magliocco set. At number 5, Angelo Lonardo. By the early 1980s, Lonardo was underboss of the Cleveland crime family, a position he'd earned by surviving one of the bloodiest internal power struggles in Mafia history. A wave of car bombings through the 1970s that killed rivals on both sides of a succession fight. Lonardo came out of it running the family's second highest office, working alongside boss James "Jack" White Licavoli, a man he had served under for decades. In 1982, federal prosecutors indicted Lonardo on narcotics trafficking and racketeering charges. He was convicted in 1983 and sentenced to life. It's worth noting what Lonardo had already survived to get to that point. The Cleveland family's 1970s succession war was fought largely with car bombs on residential streets, and Lonardo himself had been a target more than once before he ever became a defendant. Facing the rest of his life behind bars, with no war left to survive and no rival left to outlast, Lonardo made his decision. According to Department of Justice cooperation records, he agreed to cooperate with the federal government. The result made Lonardo, at the time, the highest-ranking Mafia figure ever to become a government witness. He testified against Licavoli, the boss he'd answered to for years, and his cooperation contributed to the landmark 1985-86 commission case in New York, the prosecution that convicted the bosses of 4 of the 5 families at once. Historian Selwyn Raab has credited Lonardo's insider account of a family's internal rules and chain of command as instrumental in shaping how prosecutors built the broader RICO cases that followed through the rest of the decade. His life sentence was commuted. He entered the Witness Protection Program and lived under a new identity for the rest of his life. What made Lonardo's cooperation different from anything that came before it wasn't just his rank, it was the scope of what he was willing to describe. He didn't just confirm that the Cleveland family existed, he walked prosecutors through how its rackets actually operated, year by year, decision by decision, at a moment when the Department of Justice was still building the legal playbook it would use against every other family on this list. Licavoli died in prison. Lonardo lived past the year 2000. At number 4, Philip Leonetti. Leonetti wasn't just an underboss. He was family, the nephew of Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, boss of the Philadelphia crime family through the 1980s. Scarfo raised Leonetti inside the organization from the time he was a young man and made him underboss in his early 30s, the youngest underboss the American Mafia had ever seen. By every account in the federal record, Scarfo treated his nephew less like a subordinate and more like a son. The Philadelphia family under Scarfo was, by the mid-1980s, one of the most violently unstable in the country. A string of internal killings and a level of paranoia that historian Selwyn Raab has described as extreme even by Mafia standards. In 1988, a sweeping federal RICO prosecution convicted Scarfo, Leonetti, and more than a dozen family members on charges spanning murder, extortion, and racketeering. Leonetti was sentenced to 45 years. In 1989, according to Department of Justice cooperation filings, Leonetti made contact with federal prosecutors and agreed to cooperate, against his own uncle. His testimony detailed murders Scarfo had ordered and the internal structure of the Philadelphia family, evidence that helped secure further convictions and finish dismantling what remained of the organization's leadership. In exchange, his sentence was reduced to roughly 6.5 years. He served his time, entered witness protection, and later left the program to live publicly under his own name, one of the only major Mafia cooperators in history to do so. Scarfo died in federal custody in January 2017, after close to 3 decades behind bars. The nephew he raised as his own outlived him on the outside. Of everyone on this list, Leonetti's betrayal cuts closest to the bone. This wasn't a business partner or a rival boss on the commission. It was blood. And it's exactly because the relationship ran that deep that his cooperation did the damage it did. Nobody in the Philadelphia family had more direct access to Scarfo's decisions, or more credibility testifying to what he had personally witnessed. Leonetti later published his own account of those years in a memoir, a rare instance of a high-ranking cooperator speaking publicly, in his own words, about the family he'd helped take down. At number 3, Anthony Gaspipe Casso. Casso rose to underboss of the Lucchese crime family in the late 1980s, working directly beneath boss Vittorio Vic Amuso. The two had been partners for years before Amuso took the family's top position, and together, They ran one of the most feared operations among New York's 5 families, responsible, according to federal indictments, for a string of contract killings across the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1990, a federal racketeering indictment named both Amuso and Casso. Amuso went into hiding, Casso followed, and for roughly a year, the two men ran the Lucchese family remotely, issuing orders from hiding while the FBI worked to close in. Amuso was captured in 1991 and eventually sentenced to life. Casso stayed a fugitive for nearly 2 more years after that, until federal marshals caught up with him in New Jersey in 1993. Facing the same life sentence that had already been handed to the partner he'd spent a decade running the family beside, Casso made his decision in 1994. According to Department of Justice cooperation records, he pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate extensively, providing investigators with detailed accounts of dozens of murders spanning more than 2 decades of Lucchese family activity, cooperation that Jerry Capecci has described as among the most far-reaching ever obtained from a Mafia underboss. The documented record doesn't hide the complication that followed. Prosecutors themselves grew skeptical of parts of Casso's account partway through his cooperation, and portions of his later testimony were never used at trial. But the damage from what he had already given up against the partner who had run the Lucchese family at his side for a decade was done. His account also exposed years of corruption reaching into New York law enforcement, information federal investigators spent years afterward working to independently verify and build into separate prosecutions. Amuso stayed behind bars for the rest of his working life. Casso received a reduced sentence and remains held in a federal witness protection unit, separated from the general prison population. At number 2, Alphonse D'Arco. In 1991, D'Arco held a position no cooperating witness before him ever had. He was acting boss of the Lucchese crime family, not an underboss, not a captain filling in temporarily, but the man running one of New York's 5 families day to day, while Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso, the men covered in the previous entry, operated as fugitives. According to Department of Justice cooperation filings, D'Arco's decision came from fear rather than indictment. He came to believe, based on internal Lucchese family communications he intercepted, that Amuso and Casso, the 2 men he was standing in for, had ordered his own murder over a botched hit they suspected he'd mishandled. Rather than wait to find out if he was right, D'Arco walked into an FBI office in September 1991 and asked for protection. What followed made him the first sitting boss-level leader in the documented history of the American Mafia to become a cooperating government witness while still actively holding that rank. Over the following years, he testified in a string of major federal racketeering trials, providing prosecutors with a level of structural detail, induction ceremonies, chain of command decisions, decades of unsolved homicides, that historians Selwyn Raab and Jerry Capecci have both credited as instrumental in the broader collapse of Lucchese family power through the 1990s. His testimony helped convict Amuso, contributed to the case against Casso, and touched several other commission-era prosecutions well beyond his own family. D'Arco didn't do it to save the organization, and he didn't do it to settle a grudge. He did it because he believed, correctly or not, that the 2 men he would have called his closest partners in the life were about to have him killed. What makes his case stand apart from every other name on this list is the position itself. Magliocco, Lonardo, Leonetti, and Casso each answered to someone above them when they made their choice. D'Arco, for the months he held the acting boss title, answered to no one but the commission. He was the chain of command, and he handed federal prosecutors a working blueprint of it from the inside. He entered witness protection and disappeared from public life. Amuso remains in federal prison today, serving a life sentence, a fall that began, by D'Arco's own account, with a fear that struck first. Number 1. Sammy the Bull Gravano. No relationship on this list ran deeper, and no betrayal did more damage than this one. Gravano became underboss of the Gambino crime family in the mid-1980s under John Gotti, the man who had just seized control of the family by orchestrating the December 1985 murder of boss Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse. Gotti and Gravano built the years that followed together. Gravano ran the family's construction and labor rackets across New York, generating enormous income for the organization, while Gotti became the most publicly recognizable mob boss in America, a tabloid fixture the press nicknamed the Teflon Don after he beat 3 consecutive criminal prosecutions in the late 1980s. By every account in the federal record, and in Jerry Capecchi's decades of reporting on the family, Gotti and Gravano were as close as 2 men in that world could be. Gravano was, by his own later court testimony, effectively Gotti's right hand, present for and directly involved in the decisions that ran the most powerful crime family in the country. That changed in December 1990, when the FBI arrested both men, along with consigliere Frank Locascio, on federal racketeering and murder charges. The case against Gotti rested in significant part on FBI surveillance recordings made at an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club, tapes in which Gotti was heard discussing Gravano in terms that made clear he viewed his underboss as expendable. According to the trial record, Gravano listened to those recordings during pre-trial proceedings, and hearing his own boss's private words about him is what pushed him toward the decision that would define the rest of his life. In November 1991, Gravano agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to a stack of charges, including his own admitted role in 19 murders over the course of his career, a number that remains, according to federal court records, among the highest ever personally confessed to by a Mafia cooperator, and in exchange for a dramatically reduced sentence, agreed to testify against Gotti. The trial that followed, in the spring of 1992, was covered as one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in American history, the 4th attempt in a decade by federal and state prosecutors to put Gotti away, and the first one built with an underboss testifying from the inside rather than surveillance tape alone. Gravano spent days on the witness stand describing the internal workings of the Gambino family, in a level of first-person, documented detail no cooperating witness at that rank had ever provided about a sitting boss. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts, including the murder of Paul Castellano. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and died in federal custody in 2002, having spent the last decade of his life behind bars. Gravano served 5 years under his cooperation agreement, entered witness protection, and eventually left it to live publicly under his own name, before being arrested again in the early 2000s on unrelated drug trafficking charges in Arizona, a second conviction that closed out his story with a prison sentence of its own. He would go on to give interviews and write his own account of the years he spent at Gotti's side, an unusual public afterlife for a man whose entire career had depended on the world he described staying hidden. What separates Gravano from everyone else on this list isn't the number of murders he admitted to, and it isn't the length of his testimony. It's what his betrayal actually ended. John Gotti wasn't just a boss. At the time of his conviction, he was the most famous organized crime figure alive, a man whose earlier trial acquittals had made him look untouchable to the public, and, more dangerously, to the federal prosecutors who had failed to convict him 3 times running. Gravano's testimony didn't just put one man behind bars. It closed out the era of the Teflon Don, and with it, the last stretch of American history when a sitting mob boss could function as something close to a public celebrity. The Gambino family never recovered the position it held before that verdict came down. The friendship that built it never recovered either. 6 men, 6 different reasons: fear, self-preservation, a taped conversation that told a man exactly how little he mattered to the friend he'd spent his life protecting. What connects all 6 is what federal prosecutors built directly on top of their testimony. The RICO Act, applied case after case through the 1980s and 90s, turning the very culture of loyalty the Mafia depended on into the mechanism that eventually broke it. Every one of these men held real power. Every one of them gave up someone closer to him than almost anyone else outside that world. And every one of them proved, in the end, the same uncomfortable truth the federal government spent half a century trying to establish in court. An organization built entirely on personal loyalty has no defense once the law makes loyalty the more expensive option. It's worth saying plainly, as this channel does in every episode, the men on this list, and the friends and mentors they betrayed, represent a small, documented criminal minority within a much larger Italian-American history, one built overwhelmingly by generations who had nothing to do with organized crime, and never will. Their names don't belong to that history. They belong to a federal court record. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The Five Families Files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. This has been The Five Families Files. Good night from the archive.